Für frisches Grünes gehe ich am liebsten zu Aldi. Äpfel, Trauben, Salat und jetzt kommt's. Mein Geheimtipp? Aldi Grüne Energie. Ja, richtig gehört. Ökostrom und Ökogas zum Original-Aldi-Preis. Und das Beste? Beim Wechsel erhältst du bis zum 3.11. einen 60€ Aldi-Geschenkgutschein obendrauf. Wechsel jetzt ganz einfach auf aldigrüneenergie.de/jetzt wechseln. Aldi. Gutes für alle.
Ryan Reynolds here for, I guess, my 100th Mint commercial. No, don't. I mean, honestly, when I started this, I thought I only have to do like 4 of these. I mean, it's unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month. How are there still people paying 2 or 3 times that much? I'm sorry, I shouldn't be victim blaming here. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/save. Whenever you're ready.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Single Tracks Podcast. My name is Jeff, and today my guest is Lennard Zinn. Lennard is a bike designer and frame builder based in Louisville, Colorado. His shop, Zinn Cycles, offers a full line of semi-custom and off-the-shelf bikes for riders from very small to very tall, and everyone in between. He's also the author of Zen and the Art of Mountain Bike Maintenance, one of the world's best-selling guides to mountain bike repair. Thanks for joining us again, Lennard.
Thank you.
So I want to start this discussion by talking about drivetrains, specifically, obviously, bike chains. What causes a chain to wear?
Well, generally what happens, most chains, is that there's lubricant on there, oil-based lubricant, and dirt sticks to it. So dirt gets into the chain, and you have this mixture that basically is a grinding compound of this mixture of dirt and sand. And then as the chain moves, it's just grinding away at the parts. And you have rollers and bushings and pins. And as those get worn down, then the chain gets longer. We talk about chain stretch, but chains don't stretch. It's just that there's all this wear in there, which is just making it get longer.
Oh, interesting. So is it like the rollers or like those things kind of elongating, or like what does actually cause it to get longer?
The way a chain is made is that the inner links are not flat plates. When they punch the holes for the pin, they punch them rather than like punching a hole like with a hole puncher. They're punching a hole with like jamming a ever increasing pin through it. Okay. So that rather than just making a hole, it pushes the plate, the metal of the plate inward, and forms a little tube sort of inside, which is called the bushing. Okay. And then when the chain is assembled, there's a roller that sits in between the interlink plates, and so that roller is sitting on those little tube sections there. And then the outer plates then meet the outsides of that, and the pin goes through that, all that together. And so the grinding paste is working in there. It's decreasing the outer diameter of those little bushings that the rollers sit on. It's increasing the inner diameter of those bushings so that that's all moving, able to flop around on its axis. And then the pin itself wears, as well as the inside diameter of the bushing too, where the pin is going through. So all those parts together are getting worn. There's really not essentially any significant wear between the pin and the outer plates because those don't move. The pin goes through, is fixed to the outer plate, so there's not any movement there. And also the faces of the plates, where the faces of the plates meet each other, that also wears in between them. And so everything's getting looser. The chain, there's a couple of things that happen with it. One is that the chain gets longer, as we talked about, and I'll talk about a little more detail of that later. But the other thing that happens is as those bushings and the faces of the plates all wear against, get worn, and then the chain is more flexible if you lay the chain down flat, so it's on edge on a table, and you curve it sideways as opposed to, it of course flexes easily in the up down direction, but in the sideways direction, it'll make push it and it'll make a curve, a long, very long radius curve, and then that's as far as it'll go. As it wears, that radius of that curve that you can push it to, essentially bend it laterally, that radius decrease becomes a much sharper curve. And that affects the shifting, because the way a derailleur works is that it depends on the fact that the chain is laterally fairly stiff. In other words, where it's flexible as a piece of string or a rope running on there, then if you envision it running over the rear derailleur, and then you move the rear derailleur one step laterally from one cog to the next, it's not necessarily going to want to move over to the next cog, because the rope is so flexible that it'll just follow that, it'll just make that bend, and it doesn't care to move. But the fact that the chain is laterally stiff means that when you move over one step with the rear derailleur, that it can't stay on that cog anymore that it's on, and it climbs over to the next one. And derailleurs all have a specification for how close that upper jockey wheel is to the cassette. And so that it tries to be close to it, but lots of people have their bikes poorly adjusted where the jockey wheel is not that close to their cassette. Yeah. And yet the chain still shifts. Well, that only happens if the chain is laterally stiff enough, because if that distance gets larger, then when the derailleur moves over one step, then the angle of the lateral angle of the chain at the cassette is less, and the chain feels less inclined to have to derail from one cog to the next. So that lateral wear is critical for shifting. Okay. Then the other wear that we skipped over is the elongation of the chain. And what that is that a chain is built on a half-inch standard. So that means that there's a half-inch between each roller. Okay. And all the chainring teeth are cut half-inch apart. The cassette cog teeth are a half-inch apart. But now if the distance between the rollers is bigger than a half-inch, that means that when the chain's running over the cassette and you're applying force to it via the crank, tension is pulling it, and the only place that it's applying any force to the cassette anymore is the trailing side of the top tooth of the cassette, because all of those other ones are no longer touching it, because the spacing between the rollers is bigger than the spacing between the teeth of the cassette. When all the force of your pedaling is happening between one roller and one tooth at the top of then what's going to start happening is that tooth is going to start getting misshapen. It's going to start pushing the trailing edge of it forward, and you can feel it on the tooth, because the trailing edge of each tooth then becomes sort of mushroomed out, becomes wider. And the tooth, if you look at it from the side, rather than having the shape that it used to, it becomes more shaped like a breaking wave and surfer. Yeah. It's got a hook to it. And so then if you then put on a new chain that is the right spacing, now a totally opposite thing happens, because now the bottom tooth on the cassette is the one contacting it, because all the spacing between all the rollers is exactly half-inch, but the distance between the teeth is bigger than a half-inch, because it's gotten all squished out by running the worn chain on the teeth. So then, but the chain at the bottom of the cassette does not have the kind of tension it does at the top where you're applying all this force. And so it's, especially on a small cog, it's likely to skip because the only engagement is down there, that one tooth at the bottom of the cassette. And there's this, there's the angle of the chain relative to the front derailleur, to the front chain ring, and the bouncing of that top chain. And it just is going to skip and it's going to drive you crazy. So that's the reason that, for instance, chain gauges were invented that were supposed to measure the distance between, to confirm that the distance between the all the link pins is within spec, so that you don't wear the cassette out so badly, and that there's encouragement to change your chain every either chain indicator says it's time to, or just based on mileage, whatever, 1,500 chain. And that's because chains, while they have gotten a lot more expensive, they're like 10 to 30 times more expensive than they were when I was in the early,
that's inflation.
Yeah, in the early 80s, we've got these Satasport chains. You first of all didn't have this thing where everybody says, well, if you want our drivetrain to work properly, you got to use our chain with our cassette and our derailleurs and our blah, blah. Manufacturer specific stuff. It was just like, you got a 6-speed rear end, you got a 6-speed chain, and it doesn't matter what brand, and you put it on, and there was none of that. And so we all got these Satasport chains. They were $4 each.
Whoa.
Cheapest chain you can get is like $40 now.
Right.
But still, relative to the cassette, it's very cheap. Cassettes are, $200.
Right. I mean, that's one of the earliest mechanical, like, bike repair lessons I learned was, I had a bike and I rode the heck out of it, and, it wasn't shifting right. I brought it into the shop and just figured I needed a new chain, or maybe I bought a new chain, threw it on there, and I was like, oh man, this is shifting even worse. And, the guy at the shop says, well, yeah, you wore your cassette out. And honestly, I thought that was a scam. I was like, this guy's trying to just get me to buy another cassette. But lesson learned, and the chain checker is like, it's probably my favorite tool in my whole toolbox, because it is so simple. And like you said, it can save you a ton of money and just, trouble down the line if you're checking your chain and making sure that it hasn't stretched beyond sort of that spec limit.
Yeah. So there's two things I want to mention about that. One is, I've been writing a technical Q&A column online for, with VeloNews for like 35 years, and now recently on my Substack, LennardZinn.substack.com. And that kind of question would come up, how do I know when to change my chain? And, and I'd answer and talk about the downsides of not doing it. And I had a certain number of people who would write in telling me that I was some sort of a shill for the bike component industry, trying to promote this quick obsolescence of stuff and trying to get people to spend more money on bike stuff. And they'd talk about, these were usually guys that were commuters who rode their bike. They'd got the same bike for 30 years. They left the same cassette on there and the same chain. And yes, there is something to that. If you just let it all wear together, and you're willing to accept the kind of crappy shifting that happens as the chain gets laterally more flexible, as we talked about. And you can, and especially if you had a bike old enough that it didn't even have index shifting, that you were doing it, friction shifting, and you could, then you can just, move the lever until the chain moves over, and then you recenter it to stop the noise, and then you're going. And that, yes, you could just keep riding that forever. And however, if you are somebody that, for instance, has multiple sets of wheels, like, you can't do that. Like bike racers always have multiple sets of wheels, and if you chain wear too fast, you don't just wear out one cassette, you wear out a whole bunch of them. You wear out all your wheels. And it doesn't take that long to do it. Like one race, you go, okay, put my race wheel on, and it's skipping at the beginning of the race, but then it's kind of, in a few gears, it's driving me crazy, but then I, keep adjusting for it and jumping and whatever. And by the end of the race, it's not skipping so badly, cogs, and you're able to use it on the other one. Well, then that cassette is ruined in a 1 hour race or whatever.
Yeah.
So yeah, you can just let everything wear out, not spend any money on your bike, but you better not change. you better.
Yeah. Well, I imagine eventually though, will the teeth just like break off the cassette? I mean, I imagine you'd have to run it a really long time, but yeah, as it kind of wears that breaking wave pattern into the tooth, eventually there's going to be very little left to it, right?
Conceivably that could happen, but it's probably not going to be in that person's lifetime.
Okay, that's good.
So that's one part to it. The other part that I did want to say about the chain checker is that people generally put too much faith in them. Existing technology. I assume that your chain checker is one. Most chain checkers have a little hook on one end that you hook over the roller, and then it has some length to it that's going to span a number of links. And then it's got another tooth that drops down in the chain. I realize there's some that there's just a fixed one like that. Just
yeah.
So the problem with that is that this hook that you hook into the chain first, pushing on what we'll call the leading side of that roller, and then the other hook is going to push in on the trailing side of a roller way down the length of the chain. You got me? So it's pushing these two rollers apart.
Right.
That's not exactly the same thing as measuring the distance between one pin to the next. Because if there's a bunch of flop in those rollers, that's what you're going to be looking at. And it could be that there's extra play in the rollers, but not in the actual length of the chain. So that it's not a terrible thing. It just means that you would tend to be replacing the chain sooner than it needed.
Okay.
Because the chain elongation, what is actually affecting the wear of the cassette is the leading edge of that roller. That's what pushes on. It doesn't care where the trailing edge of that roller is. And so if all of them shift back a hair, but the distance between all the pins is still half inch, then there's no need to replace that chain.
Right.
The other thing about it is that you can't use one of those on a SRAM flat top chain. So this is a road thing, but
now a mountain bike thing too, I guess, right? Does that include T-type chains?
The T-type has a flat top, but I'm not sure they changed the roller diameter. I have to look into that because what happened with the road one is the road flat top chain, the roller diameter is bigger than rollers have always been. That's always been the standard diameter of the rollers. Well, now if you got fatter rollers and you use that chain checker, then it's going to say, even a completely worn out chain, it's going to say, oh, that chain's fine. Even if it's totally worn out, because the rollers are bigger and it's going from the front edge of the one and the back side of the next one.
Okay.
So there are these chain checkers that have 3 prongs. And so Pedro's makes one, Shimano has one, Park now has one. And the way those work is you first, instead of just hooking the first hook over, you do 2 steps. You hook this first one over, and then there's another one right close to it. And and then you hook that one in. So that one is now pushing on, we'll still call this hook going on the leading edge of a roller. But then this next one that you push in is now pushing on the front, on the trailing edge. It's pinching those rollers in between it like that. So now it's fully engaged that the backside of a roller to push it forward, and then the the other tooth on the long end of the chain checker is then also touching the back side of a roller. So that then tells you very exactly, and it'll work. And the advantage is that it'll work. SRAM also makes one of these 3-prong tools because they have to, because they've got this flat top chain that has a. So anyway, those will work for any chain. They're more accurate than a two-prong chain checker, and they will also check. They don't care how big the roller diameter is. It'll still check the actual length of the chain. And then the other thing you can do is actually just measure it with a ruler. You measure 12 inches, and if you have the 12-inch ruler up against a pin on one end, and then you go to the opposite end, and if it's also right against the front edge of that pin, then the chain's fine. It's like a 16th inch longer. It's getting like, well, it's 12 and a 16th inch. That's getting about time to replace. If it's 12 and an eighth, you definitely got to get that chain off right away.
Okay. Yeah, that's a great tip. Okay, so now that we understand sort of how chains wear and what chain stretch is really about, how does lubrication affect chain wear?
First of all, if there's no lubrication and you just have completely dry chain, then you can imagine the parts just grinding away on each other because nothing's slipping easily. That's fairly obvious. But the other way it affects it is that lubricants generally, other than wax, attract dirt, and dirt sticks to them. So that's creating this grinding paste in there that's accelerating the chain wear. So if the chain is completely clean and it's lubricated well, then the friction is very low. But that with an oil-based lubricant, or which is also describes the factory lube that comes in the chain, that condition doesn't last very long because pretty soon there's dirt infiltrating it.
Yeah. Speaking of that factory lube, like that stuff's weird. It's like really sticky. It's different than any of the other lubes you would put on it. Like, what is that stuff? Is it good? Is it bad? Like, should you clean your brand new chain as soon as you get it and like put a different type of lube on?
Short answer, yes. It's very sticky and very attracts dirt, and it's not particularly low friction. It's on there because that's what was required in making the chain. So in making the chain, you have all these parts that are getting stamped out of sheet first, and you have to have lubricant, going through, that whole process on all the machines so that the stamping tools don't get dulled too quickly, and then all the chain pieces get sorted, by these vibrating things that sort them so that they fall down into these little tubes that then drop down one at a time on the assembly line, because it's all automated. It's not like people are picking up these pins and
Good.
And this system has to have a way of telling which is right side up and which is upside down on each little link pin and each little link plate and lining them up properly, and all that requires lubrication in order for it to be then sticking in the pins and just having the whole machinery work smoothly. There's just oil all over everything. And this was not an oil that was selected to make the chain run smoothly and run with lowest friction on your bike. It was a lube that was selected in order to decrease the wear on the machines that make the chain.
Interesting. So obviously, I think there are two main types of lube. One is, like you said, like an oil-based one. The other is more of like a wax-based lube. Are some lubes better than others for chain life?
Absolutely, yes. So if somebody that's interested in this, I recommend you go to zerofrictioncycling.com, which is a guy in Australia who has two concurrently drivetrain durability tests going constantly, and where he's running the drivetrain on an actual bike and driving it automatically, and then at specific intervals adding water and dirt and more lubricant and whatever to the chain, and then periodically measuring the wear on the chain.
Okay.
And then replacing the chain as needed and continuing the test. So the tests will generally go for a fixed distance, 10,000 kilometers, I think is the fixed distance that he does it. And then, and it'll document, okay, for this particular lube, it ran through 4 chains or 10 chains or no chains, whatever. So, and there is a very big difference between them. And some very expensive lubes are he also has ones where he shows the table of how many chains it went through, how, divided up into these different wear blocks is what he calls them, that describe a certain amount of distance with a certain number of applications of lube and dirt and water and whatever. And how many blocks of those each chain goes through, etc. And then but he also has tables that show dollars per 10,000 kilometers. Based on,
okay.
With this lube, I had to replace the cassette and the chain 7 times to go 10,000 Ks. And some quite expensive chain lubes are in that category where it's like, wow, you add that up and it's like $3,500.
Wow.
Go 10,000 Ks to keep everything in spec. And whereas chain wax, which is the service that we offer, chain waxing, the chain wax is where you completely clean the chain out of all oil-based lubricants, all lubricants. It's completely clean to start with. And then you submerge it in a wax, molten wax, and articulate the chain in the molten wax to make sure that the wax gets all in all the nooks and crannies. That comparing those, zero friction cycling has had, for instance, versus one expensive muck off nano lube, the over 10,000 Ks, it didn't even go to 50% wear on the chain or the cassette with the wax.
Wow.
But it went through 7 chains and 7 cassettes with the muck off nano lube. So then there's this tremendous difference in cost. We charge $35 to wax somebody's chain. Well, that's less than the cost of one chain. So you easily get that back, not to mention all the time that you don't spend cleaning your chain, because the chain is, I know we sent you one of our wax chains, and I assume that you would have had a similar experience where you can ride it through all sorts of dirt and whatever, and then you touch the chain and rub your finger back and forth and your finger comes off clean, as opposed to leaving black marks on your calves and just picking up junk. When you go to Moab, your whole chain is red and your whole cassette is red. The other side of your chain rings are all red, and you do that with a wax chain and the dust just falls off from it, and you don't have this buildup of red.
And to be clear too, a waxed chain that we're talking about, I mean, there are wax-based lubes, right? Like a Muck Off, or most brands, Finish Line has, wax-based lubricants, which a lot of people like, but those are ones where you just kind of squeeze it on just like an oil-based lube. But this is different. I mean, this is like you're submerging the chain in this melted wax, and it's a lot different, right? Can you talk about kind of the difference between a wax-based lube and chain waxing?
Yeah, I want to make the distinction there because of the fact that wax is a solid at room temperature, is that a wax-based drip lube is basically little tiny chunks of wax in a carrier.
Okay.
And it matters what the carrier is, because some carriers are ones that do contaminate the chain and attract dirt. And the other thing is that if all you did was got a new chain, put it on your bike, and then after a while you started adding your wax-based drip lube, you still have deep in the inside, you've got this original factory oil. And so that's still grinding away with all the dirt that's getting stuck in it. And this wax is not going in and replacing that.
Mm-hmm.
The carriers are very light. You know, there are wax-based lubes that we do recommend for using with a immersion wax chain.
Okay.
But those all have water as a carrier. And so, and you of course know that water and oil don't mix. So the water is just going to, if you just put one of those lubes on a factory chain lube, filled chain, it's just going to fall right off. The water is not going to move that original factory lube. And then the other thing is that a lot of the carriers of these wax-based lubes are actual solvents that will dissolve wax.
Oh, no.
So if you have an immersion wax chain and then you put on this wax, you think, oh, here's this great wax-based grip lube. I'm going to put this on there. What you're doing is dissolving out the immersion wax that you have in there and only having this relatively crappy wax,
Yeah, wax particles, sounds like.
So, so what we recommend is that, the immersion wax chain, then the beauty of it is you basically don't have to do any maintenance whatsoever. You can just, you can just immersion wax it and then ride it for 1,000, depending on the conditions, maybe as much as 2,000 miles before it would slow down at all and squeak or anything like that. And then and then you can just re-wax it. And if you never put any other drip lube on there, then you can just wipe it off and drop it in the wax bath again and be going again. But if you've ever contaminated it with one of our non-recommended wax drip lubes or with any oil-based drip lube, then the whole thing's got to be cheap. You got to start from scratch. You got to completely clean it.
Yeah.
We do it with an ultrasonic cleaner, but if you don't, you have to do a multi-step process with different solvents, shaking it for a good few minutes in each solvent, each clean solvent, and go through a whole bunch of them before then you finish with like denatured alcohol, which allows it to evaporate out fairly quickly, and then you immersion wax it again. So that makes the whole process pretty laborious. But if you just run under wax chain, rode it for 1,000 miles, threw it in the immersion wax again, then that's all you need to do. You don't spend any other time wiping, and you don't have to be cleaning off your jockey wheels and cleaning off your cassette and your chainring teeth because they won't get dirty.
Yeah, it does sound like it's a very labor intensive process, especially that first time where you have to get the chain clean. You got to make sure that it's clean. I mean, I'm sure a lot of us, we think our chain is clean, but it's probably nowhere near. If someone like you took a look at it, you'd be like, oh, no, there's still so much in here that needs to be cleaned. And then the waxing process itself. I mean, it sounds like it makes sense to send this away rather than trying to do it yourself at home, though. I mean, I suppose if you really are dedicated, you could do it yourself. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. And so to do it at home, you would have a clean jar of mineral spirits and you shake up the chain for, what I always did was 5 minutes. That's a lot of shaking.
Wow.
Then you go to a new clean jar of mineral spirits and you do that again for 5 more minutes. And then once more again. So that's 15 minutes worth of shaking in mineral spirits. Then you put it in a jar of denatured alcohol and you shake it for 5 minutes. And then you put a new clean jar of denatured alcohol and shake it for 5 more minutes. So now you spend 25 minutes, your wrist is noodle, from all this shaking.
Mm-hmm.
And then you leave it to evaporate off. And if it's a hot day, you could probably then dip it in a couple hours. Otherwise you leave it overnight. And then you have a dedicated crock pot that's got wax in it. And and then you have to have we may have a tool that's like a wire that we have the chain going up and down and up and down and up and down on this wire, so that then when we're working it in the crock pot, we keep articulating the links. You can't just drop it in there and leave it. You have to be moving it so that you're actually bending all those links and making sure that they're going through their full range of motion to get it in there.
Yeah. Well, yeah, as you said, I had a chain waxed through your service, and one of the things that I noticed immediately was just how quiet the chain was compared to what it was before. And this is on a SRAM T-type transmission. And so I'm curious, I mean, we focus a lot on increasing the life of a chain by, waxing it, by lubricating it properly. And aside from that, and aside from the sound, making the chain quieter, what are some of the other advantages to having a properly waxed chain, especially when it comes to mountain biking?
Well, it's lower friction. When the chain is quiet, that means that less of the energy you put into moving the chain, pedaling around, is being converted into sound energy.
Right.
So right there, there's two, a chain that the friction of the system as you're using it produces sound energy and heat. And so the chain is getting less hot as you ride it, and it's making less noise. And, the way we started, and I think really the whole cycling universe started, was with this chain friction test we did at VeloNews in 2012, where a buddy of mine, Jason Smith, had set up this little company called Friction Facts, where he had a very precise friction measuring device where you'd mount the chain on it and you'd measure the amount of current that it took to drive that at a fixed. And so each chain, and we did this lube test where we were just going to test all the lubes. We tested 43 different lubes. So this is 2012. There weren't as many lubes on the market. That was seemed to be a pretty broad example of the lubes that were available. And it did include some wax-based drip lubes at the time too. And each chain, we did the ultrasonic cleaning on it first, so that we'd really be comparing apples to apples. We weren't just adding a lube on top of any other factory lube or whatever lube had been on the chain before. And you'd run the chain in for 15 minutes first before you did any measurement, and then you'd take the measurements, and there was a difference, a very big difference in the friction over depending on which lube you used. And incidentally, some of those wax-based chain lubes were really slow. Lots of friction in those. But then, kind of as an afterthought, because this immersion chain waxing was something people used to do way back, in the 30s and the 50s and stuff. And we thought, well, as long as we're cleaning these things completely, we ought to try that. So we just took standard paraffin, canning paraffin, which is where you don't use a ball jar that's got the new seal on it. People used to always just have these ball jars where they'd put a layer of paraffin on the top of the jam that they were making. And so that same paraffin, we just put it in a crock pot, flopped the chain around in it for a while, and then ran it. And it was way lower friction than any of these lubes, no matter how fancy, expensive, and whatever claims they'd made and all that. And so that was pretty shocking. Yeah. But at the time, I didn't really see it as, it wasn't like I was promoting it as something to do. It was just like an interesting thing. Look at this. And then a short while after that, Bradley Wiggins set the hour record on the track. And they promoted the fact that his chain was this multi-$1,000 chain. It was just a standard Shimano chain, but they'd ultrasonically cleaned it, and they'd put immersion waxed it, but they'd also put some super slippery other stuff into the wax, graphite or molybdenum or something, and that here he'd set the hour record. And so that sort of started piquing people's interest as something that you could actually do. And then we did another chain and then there were some companies that started making specific block chain wax. So Silca is one,
right?
Molten Speed Wax is another. Ceramic Speed, although Ceramic Speed doesn't sell their block wax, they sell you wax chains that are done with their block wax. And plus, Ceramic Speed was sort of the first one because they actually bought Friction Facts. They hired Jason Smith, the guy who did this test for us, and took over his friction testing machine. And that was his job, was to come up with a drip lube that was as fast as these things.
Wow.
So he came up with this incredible wax-based drip lube that is called, I think it's Ceramic Speed UFO lube. And it was almost as fast as immersion waxing the chain, but of course it did require completely cleaning the chain. And it's in a water base. It's a water solution. And now Silca has Silca Super Secret, which is another one that's like that. So we did another follow-up friction test like that with some of these fancy block lubes that have these extra slippery things in them, and they do make a little bit of an improvement over paraffin. Still, the major jump from all the drip lubes, other than something like Silca Super Secret and Ceramic Speed UFO, the big jump is just to the based paraffin. But yes, you can get them a little faster with these other additives in them. And we do our chain waxing with the Silca block wax simply because if we can make it faster, we might as well. As long as we're doing it, the cost of the wax relative to the paraffin wax, while there's a big difference in cost between those, that's still a relatively small part of the $35 you're paying us for the chain waxing. Most of that's labor.
Right.
And so we might as well do it as fast as we can.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, like I said, I've been riding with this chain that your service waxed, and it's great. But after this discussion, I'm really convinced, because it does kind of check all those boxes in terms of, making a lower maintenance product, something that's quieter, that's going to spin more efficiently with less friction. There really isn't a reason not to do it. I mean, the cost is like you said, is much less than replacing your chain more often. And I mean, I guess the only thing is just waiting for your chain to come back. But, most of us have some extra chains hanging around. And so, yeah, if you're able to, send one off while you're still running your bike, then it's kind of a no-brainer.
So that is what we do for a lot of our customers that, we're a custom bike frame manufacturer. And that is what we do with a lot of the bikes that we sell, is we sell them with two wax chains. One of them is on the bike, and one we send along with them. And then when it's time to get that one relubricated, then they just take it off, stick on the new chain. We've already cut it to length and everything. So they just stick it on and drop the other one in the mail, and we re-wax it. And so then there is no downtime.
Yeah. How do you know when it is time to re-wax?
Well, definitely if it squeaks. Time.
Okay.
If you hear any noise, because it as you saw, it should be very quiet. And if it's no longer quiet, time to do it. And barring that, I'd say, if you're like here, Colorado, it's mostly dry. We're not like, for instance, if you were to do a really, really muddy, like that, like best example is the Unbound gravel race. And sometimes it rains the whole day. A wax chain is definitely the best thing to have for that event, but it won't make it through 200 miles in pouring rain on gravel. It will start squeaking, and you will need to add. And at that point, you can't add one of these water-based wax lubes, like drip wax lubes, like I talked about, because the chain is all wet and the water won't displace it. You have to use an oil lube on it, and then you have to get the chain cleaned and start over again at the end. But if it's just that you go out and you go on a muddy mountain bike ride, that's going to accelerate the rate at which you need to change that chain.
Okay. Yeah.
So if you're riding it on the road in dry conditions, you can probably go 2,000 miles before you need to get it immersion waxed again. And if you're riding in mud a lot, it might be as little as 500 miles, but that's still a lot of mountain biking.
Yeah, for sure. Well, let's switch gears a little bit, pun intended. You're involved in a couple of different bike brands, Clydesdale, which makes bikes for big and tall riders, and Tui, which makes bikes for smaller riders. Hopefully I'm saying that right. What led you to start these brands?
Well, and our Zinn brand, which is fully custom, mostly titanium.
Okay.
Bikes.
Okay.
Full suspension bikes. Yes, and so what led us to make those was that early in my business, so I started Zinn Cycles in 1982. And originally I was making only mountain bikes because I had been working for Tom Ritchie before that.
Mm-hmm.
And in 1982 in Colorado, when I started March 82, you could not get a mountain bike because the only one really doing any significant quantity was Tom Ritchie, which is where I'd been working.
Mm-hmm.
And he was partners with Gary Fisher at the time. Ritchie Mountain Bikes is what they were called. And Mike Senior from Specialized bought sort of a size run of those and took them to Japan and had them copied. And that was the original stump jumper, but that didn't come in until the fall of 1982. So originally all I was doing was mountain bikes, and just because, and I could charge almost whatever I wanted because and that was the days when there was no Grupo,
Right.
It was very expensive to do it because everything was a mismatch. You had Magura brake levers, you had Mayfac cantilever, cyclocross brakes. You had like a Simplex front derailleur and a Puree rear derailleur, and you had a TA triple crank, and you had high E hubs, and everything was this mix of components. You often made the handlebar, the bullmoose stem and handlebar that Tom Ritchie is once again making for those old people, those people that have old Ritchies. He's once again making those bars.
That's right. Yeah.
Stem bar. But then by the fall of that year at the bike shows, Sun Tour introduced a whole mountain bike Grupo. Mm-hmm. Specialized had the stump jumper. Pretty soon WSI, which was Diamondback, had a mountain bike, and pretty soon they were way less expensive than I could make a bike for. So that kind of that business kind of went away. And then I was making mostly road bikes, but then I sponsored a women's racing team starting in 1984 that my wife and I and another woman we just created this team, and it was the first women's only cycling team in Colorado, and I was making all the bikes for them, and it for quite a while, from 1983, late 83, 1984 until about 1990, more than the majority of customers were women, mostly small women, because there were good alternatives for them. They couldn't get a bike that you could really race on if you wanted a high-end racing bike, that all these companies made small bikes, but they tended to be, a 10-speed, more like a kid's bike, it wasn't like a high-end Colnago or something. It was a cheaper bike. And so then somewhere around 1990-ish, Trek and Specialized and a bunch of these Cannondale, these companies started doing sort of, quote, women-specific design. They started realizing that women cyclists do more than just spend money on cycling clothing, that they actually buy bikes and they care about the quality of the bikes. And so and this was at a time when the bikes I was still making steel bikes. and people were really interested in steel. The fit, the whole thing was about the custom fit and the paint job. And because we were all using the same tubing, essentially, Reynolds or Columbus tubing, tube diameters were the same.
Right.
The lugs restricted you to fairly conventional geometries, and but then became the era of these much lighter bikes, aluminum, and then aluminum with carbon stays, and then fully carbon bikes. And all of a sudden now people cared much more about weight than about fit. So people could get a really light bike that, small women could get a really light bike that fit reasonably well. Companies that was much lighter than we could make. And so that business kind of was disappearing. And, the reason Zinn Cycles has been in business for 42 years is because we don't try and go head to head with Trek and Giant and Specialized. We look for niches where they aren't. And so obvious niche, I've shrunk a lot, but I was 6'6", and a lot of my customers were tall and had come to me because I understood the problems of tall bikes. I first started doing it because of the fact when I was on National Cycling Team, the bikes that I got from sponsors tended to shimmy like crazy on the descents. And I have a degree in physics. I'd done my senior seminar on the stability of the bicycle. I knew I could do better than that myself, and I just started making my own bikes. And so there was always a certain number of tall people coming to us, but then we really, from 1990 on, really focused on that niche of really big and tall people. And we had some stops and starts along the way of sort of production bikes for big people that we tried to do for Project Big, and then some other things where we tried to, but these were still steel bikes. Then we started the Clydesdale line because by then we were making 100% titanium bikes, and the fully custom ones were very expensive. And we knew that there were, and at the time, and then I was also, starting, 15, maybe 20 years ago, I started designing bikes for KHS. And so there was this KHS road model and a mountain bike model. So that only came in 2XL and 3XL that I designed. It said designed by Lennard Zinn on it. And so that was a bike that somebody could get originally for $1,500. Now they're like $2,000, but basically a inexpensive steel bike that was going to hold up for a really big person and wasn't going to shimmy, and it had all these design features in it that I'd put into these. But there were a lot of people in between that $2,000 steel bike category and the $8,000 custom titanium bike who were big people who they didn't want this cheaper bike, but they couldn't make that leap. And we just tried to fill the space with the Clydesdale. And the idea with the Clydesdale was this is an unbreakable bike. You can be 450 pounds and the wheels are going to hold up, and we do everything proportional. The crank length is proportional. We make really long cranks and really short cranks based on person's leg length, not on just whether, all bikes need to have, most mountain bikes, 175 crank. That's what.
Right.
and anyway, we just then carried the design philosophy I'd used with the custom bikes into this Clydesdale line. And also then we did do our own carbon fork. So this is for the road and gravel bikes, and road and gravel e-bikes too. We also do Clydesdale and 2 titanium e-bikes. This fork that is a carbon fork that has a long enough steering tube for really big people. It's an extra reinforced steering tube. If people have a bunch of spacers and a really huge person, we don't need to worry about steering tube breaking. And that the testing, which we have done in Germany at the EFB testing lab, the premier testing lab for the bike industry, is tested at a much higher loads than the rest of the industry tests their forks at, so that this is a fork that, you can be 450, 500 pounds, and this fork is going to last you. And that, a lot of tandem manufacturers now are buying them from us because it's like couple of people on a tandem.
Yeah.
Weight that'll.
Right.
So that was what started the Clydesdale. And then really what happened with the Tuis was we were doing custom titanium e-bikes, and, e-bikes have a similar issue, which is most of the e-bikes that are on the market are really heavy, A, and B, come in really limited size ranges. So if you were somebody that wanted a performance e-bike, also that would go 28 miles an hour instead of the 20 miles an hour that most e-bikes are limited to, and you wanted to have it fit quite well and you were a small person, there was really no other choice than us, our titanium e-bikes. And so then we started seeing a demand from small women again, which we hadn't really seen since the 80s. And so that translated then into small women getting normal titanium bikes from us too. And so then we're like, well, we should once again fill this space between what other people are doing and what are the cost of our custom bikes, and do a stock size one that goes, because you get a carbon XS extra small. There are manufacturers that offer extra small carbon gravel bikes and carbon mountain bikes and stuff. And in my estimation, they're not extra small. The standover height is too high. Their top tube lengths are way too long. And we, again, apply that same philosophy where the crank length is proportional to the rider, which allows us to bring the top tube shorter and reel in the front end, and not have still without having pedal overlap of the front wheel, and do the same with the e-bikes. And so that's what the Tui models are, and they go down to extra small. And so it's definitely smaller than any production quality bike you can get from anybody. And
well, you mentioned how for tall or smaller riders, a big part of it, obviously the frame design is important, but so are the component selections. And you mentioned crank arm lengths. I'm curious about wheel sizes, because I see that you have a couple of bikes with 32-inch wheels, and maybe there's one or two even with 36-inch wheels. I know for a lot of people, many years ago, there was this transition to bigger wheels from 26 to 29. And, obviously there were a lot of advantages to 29-inch wheels, and that's sort of become the standard for mountain bikes now. So I'm curious, what's the deal with 32-inch wheels and 36-inch wheels? Was this a standard that existed before? Like, why did it exist? And sort of like, what's available in that diameter today?
It's a little of the chicken and the egg thing. I'm not quite sure what started the 36-inch wheels. There was something called monster bikes, which was like a beach cruiser, very heavy curved steel tube bike with these 36-inch wheels, and a coaster brake, very cheap bike. And I don't know whether that came first or whether it was unicycle riders who brought that first. But, a unicycle, you're connected one-to-one to the wheel. So if you want to go faster, you have to have a bigger wheel, for a given cadence.
This is like a speed unicycle is a 36-inch wheel.
Exactly. Although there are these unicycle riders who ride these crazy trails and stuff and jump off big drop-offs and do amazing stuff on unicycles. And then again, you get some of those other advantages of, a 29-inch wheel doesn't fall into a 26-inch hole, as you used to say with mountain bikes. And the same thing, of course, applied with a unicycle, and it was even more so because you'd get stuck in the hole.
Right.
Was that size. So they really were the ones pushing the envelope with the 36-inch, and then making because that monster bike with monster cruiser thing with the 36-inch wheels, those were really pretty cheap pinned rims and really crappy tires, and And so the unicycle people, then there's this Nimbus brand that made these really beefy rims because these people are jumping off of huge things, all no suspension on one wheel. Mm-hmm. And the tires were really, Nimbus tires were really, really beefy too. And then they carried it down to 32 inch as well. So that basically those are the same rim, Nimbus Knight Rider rim and tire, and in both 32 and 36, which is where we started with our bikes with those, because again, we were, the monster bike was a novelty bike. It was just like, this is a high G whiz factor. Look how big my wheels are compared to yours. and there was and my first 36er I made was for a artist going to Burning Man. Who wanted, he was a really tall guy, couldn't ride one of those monster bikes, and he wanted a bike that was a steel bike that was completely unpainted, that would just kind of rust, look like it just rusted into the desert of Burning Man,
Mm-hmm. Sounds cool.
36-inch wheels. But my philosophy, one of the beauties of mountain bikes is that you do have all these wheel sizes with quite a number of decent tires and rims available. Mm-hmm. Starting, actually all the way at 12 inch, 16 inch, 20 inch, 24 inch, 26 inch, 27 and a half, 29. And thing that I loved about that was that you could make the wheel size also proportional to the rider, not just the crank length and the frame diameter. And if you saw the bike at a distance with nothing in the frame to give away its relative size, it looked proportional, whether it was a little bike for a little person with 24-inch wheels, or a big one with 29-inch wheels, or a really, really big one with 32-inch wheels. Mm-hmm. And so that was how we started doing some custom Zinn titanium 32-inch wheel bikes, every now and then a 36-inch. But we tended to do it for people that were really tall. And my feeling about it is that, the bike does look standardly proportioned for like a 6'10" to 7-foot person on a 32-inch wheel. That's a normally proportioned bike. It looks like a normal bike at a distance. And if you're like 7'4" or 7'6", then 36-inch makes sense. Yes, lots of people want 36-inch wheels still just for the gee whiz factor, but it's those Nimbus rims and tires are super heavy. And if you're a 5'8", 150-pound person, that is such an enormous percentage of your weight that you're not going to get down trail or road very fast on that thing. It just takes so long to wind it up. When we do e-bikes with 32-inch and 36-inch wheels, and that's freaking incredible, because then you don't have to worry. You don't have to bring it up to speed, and then you just feel absolutely invulnerable on them, because it feels like nothing can knock you over. Now we have, there's another size, 750D, which WTB is doing, which is in between 29-inch and 32-inch. And if you compare the sizes, the bead seat diameter of a 700C wheel, which is the same as 29-inch, is 622 millimeters. And of a 750D, it's 660. So that's 38 millimeters larger than 622, which is an inch and a half. So basically it takes a 29-inch, makes it a 30.5-inch. And then a 32-inch is, and if you go down a step from 29-inch, a 650B or 27.5-inch is 584, which is, again, 38 millimeters smaller than 700C/29-inch. So that's an inch and a half smaller. So 27.5, 29-inch, 30.5 is the 750D. And then you go 26 millimeters bigger, which is essentially only 1-inch step. It's actually a 1-inch step from the 750D to the 32 inch.
Mm-hmm.
And then the step to 36 inch is a huge step. That's 101 millimeters. It is literally 4 inches bigger. So, but along the way, 24 inch, 26 inch, 27.5 inch, 29 inch, 750D/30.5 inch, 32 inch. Those are all sort of normal steps, like an inch and a half, maybe 2 inches,
right?
Smaller steps, and makes it quite a viable thing for people. And now Nexty is doing unicorn carbon rims. It's offering unicorn carbon rims in 32 inch and 36 inch. So that's going to be a game changer for non-e-bikes in 32 and 36 inch, that you could get a reasonable weight wheel. And Maxxis is in the testing phase. They're supposedly going to do a 32 by 2.25 inch tire. And that will be the downside of those Nimbus tires is there's only one tire. It's got this
right
tread that's not particularly, that works on road, kind of works on, but it's not, you don't get choices of different types of knobs and you have a very, very heavy carcass. And so I expect that the Maxxis tire will be much lighter and have more standard kind of knobs and traction range and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and obviously nobody's making a suspension fork specifically for 32, certainly not 36 inch wheels. Can you fit a 32 though, like on any of the ones that don't have a crown, like inverted forks or anything like that? Or are we strictly talking rigid bikes for those sizes?
It's got to be a rigid fork, because there's none of these forks that won't hit the fork crown if you, when the fork is its full length. Yes, there are some that of the inverted forks, one that has an arch is just not going to go in, but an inverted fork. But then as soon as the suspension moves, it'll hit the fork.
Right. So you could lock it out, but you just couldn't actually use the suspension on it.
But with a 32 inch wheel, you can use the Envy mountain fork.
Okay.
Carbon rigid Envy mountain fork works, and we've actually, we've been making a steel fork for the 32ers for the Clydesdale. We call it the BFG. Clydesdale BFG is the one with 32 inch wheels, and the EBFG is the e-bike version. And we've been doing that with a steel fork that we make, but we're now converting to make that with the Envy mountain fork. And then the 750D, there's an Envy adventure fork that is a rigid carbon fork that's quite a bit lighter than the mountain fork, that makes, for a really cool gravel bike with the 750D size for a tall person, that's a awesome thing, because the WTB 750D rims and tires are really nice, and then with that fork, it's not that much of a weight gain, but boy, it rolls over anything, where you can take a gravel bike on some pretty rough trails, and because of that same thing that we all saw when we went from 26 inch to 29 inch, where we could just roll over a bunch of stuff with a rigid bike that you would have to have suspension with 26er to do. That's happening too. So
yeah, that's awesome. Well, speaking quickly about smaller riders, a lot of what we're talking about is fit. Is it hard to scale a bike in terms of the weight for smaller riders? I mean, it seems like you can get the fit, but is there some point where you're going to have to, you're not going to be able to take away enough weight to keep that proportion of like bike to rider where it needs to be?
Yeah, that's just a given. It's that there's a certain number of things that any part of the bike has to have, whether it's the frame, whether if it's a suspension frame, then you got a shock, and you've got the links and the pivots and the bottom bracket shell and the head tube and the dropouts, and all that stuff, those weigh the same no matter how big the bike is. Mm-hmm. So it's only the little pieces that connect them, you know, that especially on a carbon bike are so light that it's like not even worth mentioning, really. And then the same with a wheel. I mean, wheels still got to have spokes and a rim, and yeah, you can make it somewhat lighter, but like,
and like your derailleur, everybody's derailleur is the same. They're not making like size small derailleurs that weigh less, right?
Same with the, you know, rotors. Yes, you can get a smaller rotor, but still the hub is going to be the same, and the pedals are going to be the same, and the saddle's going to weigh the same, and the dropper post is going to weigh the same, and maybe their handlebars will be cut a little shorter, but, you know, maybe their stem will be a little shorter, but the headset's going to weigh the same. So, and, you know, that's sort of been, you know, in UCI road racing, that was fundamentally discriminatory, where they have a weight limit on the bikes, you know, that what you race in the Tour de France or something can't weigh less than 6.7 kilos. Well, it's pretty easy to make a bike a lot lighter than 6.7 kilos nowadays. And especially if it's going to be for a really small person. But that means that the 200 pounders are riding on the same weight of bike as the 110 pound guys. And that's fundamentally just unfair. And yeah.
Huh. Interesting. Well, final question for you. So sort of looking at modern mountain bike geometry and component sizing, are there areas where you think designers have taken things a little too far, especially at the detriment of these riders who are either really tall or really small?
Yeah, one specific example is the length of the steering tube on the forks. That those just keep getting shorter, and it's ridiculous. It means that to make a bike for a really big person with a suspension fork, you just have to have this really short head tube. So the only way to do it, you know, is to have a fork that's really way overkill for them, you know, a super huge travel fork, just so that you can have the height of the head tube enough, because the steer is so short.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, are the steer tubes so short because of the head tubes, or what's sort of driving that?
Yeah, it's the manufacturers, for the most part, that where the majority of the forks are sold to, OEM manufacturers, are shortening their head tubes because they're increasing the travel of the bikes. And so the head tubes get shorter and shorter. So then the fork manufacturers go, well, we can save a few pennies on each fork by not having that any longer steer than we need, and the rest of the world be damned, you know, if they want a longer steer, tough.
Well, and I'm sure part of it's aesthetics at that point too. I mean, I think you mentioned it. Tall people may not want all that kind of extra steer with the spacers and everything. It just doesn't look great, and so they just figure people are going to cut it anyway, even if it doesn't fit them.
Exactly. That's one of the reasons I was talking about, that the bikes with the bigger wheels end up looking proportionally, because then the head tube isn't this super long thing that's longer than the diameter of the wheel or something. You know, it's now all proportionally, and you know, where the small person pays the price is things like Q factor, how far their feet are apart. You know, the shorter you are, the shorter your legs are. If your feet are wider apart, that triangulates your leg angle much more than a really tall person who's, and that every time we go to wider rear ends, which, you know, has been a creep, you know, when I was working for Tom Ritchie, the rear end was 126 millimeters wide, and now standard on a mountain bike boost, you know, is 148. But then you got 157 is also becoming standard. And then, of course, with fat bikes, it's way out there. Right. And the person that is paying a big ergonomic price is the short person whose legs are angled way out there. It's not good for their hips. It's not good for their knees.
Yeah. Fascinating. Well, Lennard, thanks so much for taking the time to chat. I learned a ton, and I'm sure our listeners have as well. So thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Well, you can find out more about the chain waxing service and some of the bikes we talked about on the website, zinncycles.com, and we'll have that link for you in the show notes. That's all we've got this week. We'll talk to you again next week.